All right. Hello, everyone. It's good to be back again. For those who are new to the channel, first time joining the stream, so welcome. My name is Ben Hong. And so I'm the host for this live stream. And so a little bit about me. A lot of my background is boiled down in web development. I work a lot in open source. So if you're familiar with Vue as a JavaScript framework or Angular, so I do a lot of work with both teams, doing work with documentation, working with the community, just generally just trying to help make tooling better for the web community so that we can just developers can build awesome things. I'm a huge Note nerd as well. You might have seen some of my content on Obsidian as well as other things when exploring things like Notion and that kind of stuff. And so, generally speaking, when it comes to what exactly is this new format of Ben's Open Tabs, in the past I've done work with Ben's Obsidian office hours. We've done productivity office hours, and we've done tech content as well. And so in order to keep the content going in a way that I think works well with the way my brain works, and also just a lot of things are just changing from a week to week. And so came in with this new format called Ben's Open Tabs, which is a little cheeky play on the fact that, let's face it, a lot of us when we're in our browsers, we got a lot of ideas going and we got a lot of things we want to explore. And so this format just lets me combine a lot of those past formats where we have office hours where when people actually have questions, we can certainly answer them and do either more of a tutorial style format where we talk about what the concepts are and explaining those, but also giving us space to also move into some, whether it's like co-working sessions or paired programming where I'll have a side project that we're working on and getting to talk about those. And then as always, if there's like some new plugin or some tooling that I want to talk about and nerd out about, then that gives space for that as well. So there's a new open format that lets us adapt to the various things. So yeah, super excited to have this and just to have this around and just hang out with y'all. Okay, so that takes care of that. And so honestly, it's been a little while since I've been on the stream. I've been in a hibernation, if you'll say, just trying to experimenting with a lot of things and exploring different technologies. Certainly, AI will certainly be a topic that comes up when it comes to these live streams and content that you'll see from me coming forward. It's certainly a big part of its impact in terms of people's workflows, and there's a lot of questions around it. And so I've had my time with it to sit and think with it rather than be reactionary. And so we'll definitely get more into that over the coming sessions and that kind of thing. So as far as things I want to cover to start, I figured since it's been a little while since I've been on the stream, it might be good to talk about the current state of affairs as far as like where I am with my tooling, some of the workflows and that kind of thing. All right. So first thing first, when we want to talk about tech stack, what am I building with? What I've been working with these days? Unsurprisingly to most of you, my preferred framework of choice to this day still, I largely build with Vue and Nuxt as well. So let me actually open that up in a new tab. Let me see, can I bring that over here? Perfect. So I would say Nuxt and Vue are still my go-to when it comes to building. It's basically applications. And I've also been doing a lot of work with Angular, so that's another one that I've had fun building with, and honestly, it's been a joy working with the team. So they are doing a lot of interesting work as far as exploring new concepts, especially the work with signals and reactivity, signal forms, a lot of cool stuff on that end. But at the moment, still, I think for my go-to, just because I think of my past work and just the way my brain works at this time, Vue and Nuxt still my personal go-to. And then as far as like where we go beyond that, right? Because Vue and Nuxt, this is generally very web specific, but as we grow our skills as developers, it's certainly a question of what about exploring other things regarding mobile and other things. And some of you may have heard of Electron, for example. Electron is big on helping to create desktop apps. And in my time off, I was exploring a lot when it comes to the concept of desktop apps that really have local first concepts. And so if you're new to that, it's really this idea essentially that actually, let me queue up a quick local first apps. So yeah, so local first software is really this idea that you are keeping your data basically on your computer. The funny thing about all this is that this is how computers always work from the beginning. Prior to the internet, right? We store stuff on our hard drives, on our laptops, and that was the data. Certainly with the web and everything, there has been a really big shift towards cloud. And again, lots to love about the web. I've been doing web for basically most, if not all of my career, and love everything about the web. It's just one of those things where when we think about software and the implications of being completely contingent on everything being in the cloud, there is something to be said about the trade-offs of that in terms of having our data basically we have this dependency. And so if the cloud server ever goes down, we are completely at a loss. And more importantly, for a lot of these cloud services, especially when we're talking about databases and that kind of thing, when you're like using note-taking services, for example, a lot of times they would encode your data in such a way that even when you exported the data, I've had this experience one too many times, it was basically a proprietary format. So it was really difficult to parse. And so unless someone had spent the time to actually go through, figure out the format, and figure out a way to convert it over to whatever note-taking app you're going to next, it was largely a pain. And so we'll talk a little bit about productivity and notes in terms of where I'm at with that. But that's a quick plug. That's one of the reasons why to this day, I still love Obsidian. So anyways, with this local first software, that's something I've been exploring with a lot. And so when you're thinking about desktop apps and that kind of thing, certainly in my mind, Electron is one of the first ones that will come up. And the other one that I want to bring to your attention that I've been exploring with is Tori. And so let me bring that across next to it. Here we go. Cool. And at least it's Tori. It could be Tauri, but I'm going to call it Tori. So Electron is completely basically JavaScript, TypeScript first, and it has a long track record as far as building proven apps. I think Slack, VS Code, a lot of the things have been derived from Electron. Now, one of the things about Electron, though, that has been discussed over the years is that the bundle size is usually pretty large, and it can be pretty intensive from a performance perspective in terms of how much memory it consumes, and that's been like a common complaint. And so naturally, as a web developer, or as a developer, actually, it has nothing to do with just being for the web. You always want to look at different alternatives to see what the community is looking at in terms of how we solve these problems. And so while Electron was a good exploration, one of the ones I've been spending more time on, because I think there are signs within the community that indicate having something that's more Rust-based could be a better, let's call it a better foundation for applications. And so Tori is one that a friend of mine, so Jacob, he recommended this one because he works with the team or is on the team. And so Tori is basically just Rust-based. And so the challenging part about obviously working with Tori, though, is that if you don't know Rust, this can be there's a bit of a learning curve, to say the least. That's to be expected. But with the AI tools that we have today, it certainly does make the learning onboarding a lot easier. And so once again, that's not to say that I'm of the philosophy that you just let the AI write everything, but it's just in terms of onboarding and figuring out concepts. I did find that, especially with the state of AI that it is today, in the event you're looking to start to get onboarding with Rust, that's been actually a pretty fun process. I've been playing around with some local desktop apps. And so honestly, it's an opportunity for us to have a session, honestly. Probably I can go through a little bit of a Tori 101. We could probably think of a little app that we can build together. And that way we can just see what that experience is. And at the same time, we can walk through my own workflow with AI and how that's been working. Hey, Damage MT in the chat. Hello, how's it going? That is a cool emoji. Where is that? Future Man. I like it. Yeah, so Tori's been heavily in my radar just because a lot of the tool chain that we're seeing in web development as well. So if you haven't been paying, hopefully this has come across your radar, but Vite is basically front-end build tool. Whether it's bundling, tool chain, it's the creator of it is also the same creator as Vue. Evan Yu is responsible for founding the team. I believe, let me see, just make sure, Vite Cloudflare, to make sure I am quoting this correctly. Yeah, so recently Cloudflare acquired Void0, which was basically like the company behind that was built to support Vite and that kind of thing. So they've recently had a merger, although perhaps acquisition is the better term. Don't quote me on that from a legal perspective. But basically they have joined forces. But anyhow, all that to say, so Vite, if it hasn't come across your radar, essentially, if you think of Webpack and some of the grunt, especially for some of the, I'm trying to think, Gulp for those who have been working with tooling for a long time. Basically, it's what it is. It's like a really fast way for you to bundle, do plugins and all that stuff. And it's truly, some of the speed on this is it's ridiculous. But a lot of this is built on Rust, and a lot of the explorations are around how to create Rust-based tooling so that the web can basically get faster. Because it seems that, as far as I understand it, there is essentially a limitation to a performance bottleneck when it comes to just using a pure node, basically using JavaScript as the runner for everything. And so knowing this with the Vite bundler, I think, what was I getting at? Oh yeah, so this was one of the reasons why I wanted to look into Tori as well, is because given that the signs of the web tool chain have moved in more of a Rust direction, then there certainly is this question of, okay, how would that look like if we're thinking about it from like a desktop perspective, right? And if we're looking at mobile apps, compilation, that kind of thing. And so I guess to talk a little bit more about Tori as well, it's supposed to be cross-platform. So here you can tell like the marketing here says that it can be built across any of the platforms: Linux, Mac OS, Windows, Android, iOS, all of them from a single code base. And so I will say I haven't gotten to the point where I've really explored its abilities to ship Android, iOS apps. Mainly I've been focusing on the desktop portion just because that's where my ideas have been, just to understand it. So, but it's been a lot of fun to play around with this and to start thinking about apps at this scale, because I think with this, like a little bit of a forward commentary, but especially given the state of AI that we have, and everyone's starting to explore different tooling, how they're using agents to do things. I do think we're entering a world where, honestly, this trend I think has always been happening. AI is just, I think, accelerating it, where we're going to see a lot more niche tooling. So rather than, I think it was my friend, so you might have seen some of his work. He's great. Jason Langsdorff, he does a lot of, lately he's been doing a lot of stuff on YouTube with like dev shows. So if you do, let's see, Code Dev TV. Yeah. So here we go. So this is Code Dev TV. So this is basically a huge production studio around creating quality content around developer, either tooling, content, all that fun stuff. And so if you haven't checked them out before, Code TV, my brain's remembering as Code Dev. Code TV, phenomenal job done by Jason. But anyhow, sorry, returning to my original point regarding the Tori app and desktop. So I was mentioning that given the state of AI, we're seeing a lot more niche building of tools, because nowadays, rather than having to take a generic tool, say like Notion, right? Notion's a built to have a lot of generic blocks to try to fit everyone's use case, and then they try to make it easy enough for you to customize it so that it works for whatever you want. But we all know generally when you try to bundle a bunch of functionality into one thing without a specific goal in mind, then we end up with kind of a generic solution, right? And so with AI, though, we're seeing a lot of people exploring personalized tooling, where rather than, for example, building a note-taking app that can work for anybody, we're seeing some people that might, I don't know if note-taking is actually probably the best example. Let's flip this. So rather than using Notion and forcing Notion to create some sort of life system OS, and so basically, if you're not familiar with that, essentially it's where people would take Notion and try to design like little dashboards with it, like force it to work in a certain way to capture data. Some people are just using AI to build their personalized life dashboards where they track certain habits, they're doing frequency of things. And so while there's certainly commentary to be made about like the quality of code and whatnot, for a lot of people, if you're just building code, like an app for yourself, especially if you're not tracking any sort of sensitive information like recording data, payments, that kind of thing, then for a lot of times, even if we were to use the term like AI slop, it doesn't really matter because they're not shipping production code. Like the code they have works for them. It's good enough. It solves their specific purpose, and they're not trying to sell it to anyone. So in that regard, it really does solve the job. It does the job for a lot of people. And so as a result, I think when we look at tooling for Tori and a bunch of these other things, for me, I think it's really interesting because then we'll get to allow people to break that dependency. I think the more we can also share these sort of ideas, that if you're just building an app for yourself, for instance, and you don't really need all the cross-sync data and all that stuff, like just having it saved locally, more than adequate. So all this to say, just ideas I've been exploring with to give developers more opportunities to figure out what works best for their particular systems, what works best for their communities, and so that they can be better equipped to help to keep solving problems. And that to me, I think is the most important part about being a developer. Let's see, as far as, so that's like the framework side of things. So yeah, basically Vue 3 TypeScript all the way as much as possible, just because it's, again, the mental models for me work really well. It's obviously, I spend a lot of time with the team working on stuff, so it's just a natural go-to. Again, my second choice at this point in terms of like, or I'm happy to also work with it, is like an Angular code base, especially with all the recent changes that they've been making. Love seeing the innovation happening with the Angular team. So big shout out to them for all the hard work they've been doing. Let's see. Otherwise, from a tech perspective, I'm trying to think. HTML hasn't changed much, so that I don't use any minute. Let's see. I'll just that as far as HTML goes, I don't use any of those. Like, what is there? These I'm like blanking on the name right now. Shorthand. It's not Emmet. Let's see. Yeah, see, that's what it thinks is. I'm not talking about. Oh yeah, I'm talking about template engines. Okay, this is where, again, thankfully the AI search has gotten a bit more helpful in the suggestions. But anyhow, yes. Sorry. In terms of template agents, yeah, I'm still not particularly bought into Pug, Jade, that kind of things. Haml. I understand it's common in certain frameworks, and again, if I was working with the team, I'd be happy to do it. But just personally, I haven't found it to really optimize my workflow, and so it's just still use plain HTML. As far as styling goes, CSS, I've had my back and forth with it a lot. So in terms of, some of you are probably familiar with things like Tailwind, who knows CSS as well. So let me cue that up. Okay. So this is the big trend, especially prior to AI, of utility CSS. And so again, I think probably this really does deserve a discussion all on its own. But for me, again, I did my exploration with it. I understand the selling points of it. However, for me, I think after trying it, again, trying to go all in on it, working on different projects with it, personally, I still find that this is still, it feels still like just another way to write CSS, but another way to write inline style CSS. Again, I understand the standards and that kind of thing, but there are other ways to enforce it that I've, in my experience, that leverage, like it just, one, keeps the markup a lot cleaner, and two, I just think you can still capture a design system, because that's what I like in my mind when I see a lot of design systems. I think it's oftentimes sold as a way for people who don't like writing CSS to just have a consistent way to write CSS, and there are other ways to achieve it. Especially when I think a lot of times with utility CSS, it can get to a point where if you're not careful, like anything else, like it can get out of hand, or you lose the script on why you did it to begin with. And so an example of this would be like dynamically generated utility CSS. That to me is a funny concept, because the whole point of utility CSS is that you have this set number of classes that you have that then like confine the user to like, okay, every time I use, like in this example, like text gray 600, I have a very consistent thing that I expect. And so when you start allowing people to generate dynamic classes, then really you're truly getting into like, it does basically just feel like another authoring format for inline CSS, because then at that point, why wouldn't you do just that? So for me, at least as far as my personal workflow and where I'm at this point, I've basically gone back to not traditional CSS. I still think while there are a lot of things to love about vanilla CSS, I still think there are advantages using a preprocessor. So I personally still use Sass, although not just Sass, I use SCSS specifically. And I think it's funny, now that I'm saying this aloud, I actually have forgotten the differences between SCSS and Sass. They were supposed to basically, yeah, here we go. Yeah, so let's see. Let me just make sure I'm stating this correctly. All valid CSS. Sass is more unusual. Uses, yeah, okay, that's right. Okay, now I remember. Okay, so in case you didn't know about this, Sass is actually correct, the preprocessor I'm using, but the syntax is actually where it's a bit more opinionated. So Sass with the file name, when the file name is SCSS, it basically leverages the CSS syntax and then it just adds some superpowers to it. Whereas when you use the Sass, you're opting into a specific type of formatting that allows the CSS to work. And so in this one, it explains that it uses indentation rather than curly braces. And so again, there are plenty of people who have their opinions on things. Coming from Vue, it should be unsurprising that I am a big believer in progressively enhancing on things that people already know and are familiar with. And rather than just, so again, SCSS is CSS syntax with additional superpowers, whereas Sass is another way to write it where you have to get rid of curly braces. You have to remember to do new lines instead of semicolons. So it's just another learning barrier. And so especially when I think from a team perspective, I think trying to keep things closer to its fundamentals with good abstractions is really key, I think, for any kind of framework and growth of like technological capabilities. So that's where I am from a tech stack perspective. All right, let's talk productivity a little bit. Where am I at with my productivity stack? First thing first, my productivity system, unsurprisingly, centers really at this point a lot around Obsidian to this day. For those who are new to Obsidian, the way I would describe Obsidian is a way to take notes and you own all the notes on your computer. So this is perhaps one of the best examples to me of local first software, because when you create a note in Obsidian, it is a plain text file inside of your computer. So in this particular instance, this is my current Obsidian here. So you see that this is my note for Ben's open tabs. And so this is the first episode. I have my social media stuff I want to make sure I talk about. And so if I open this inside of my desktop app here, you'll see here that it's just this .md file inside of a folder. And if I opened it inside of a text editor, let's see, if I open TextEdit, which is a default text editor that I believe every Mac comes with. So here it is. Here's TextEdit. So if I drag it inside of here and let it open, you'll see here that while it's certainly not very pretty, you can understand it all. You can see that, oh yeah, here's the environment, things I want to try to do, verify things. Here is my checklist. It's plain text. And I think one of the biggest advantages of the plain text format is that it's not proprietary, right? In the event that Obsidian should disappear tomorrow and some virus comes through and wipes out all my Obsidian executables, I can still open this file. I still have access to the data in a way that I can still eventually figure out a way to navigate to new tooling if I really need to. Or I can just modify it directly, because at the end of the day, it's just plain text. Compare this to, for example, let's see, I don't have one on the top of my head, but let's see, Notion API export page, right? Let's see, do they have an example of this? If you export the content, PDF doesn't count because PDF you can't edit, and then rendering it is always a bit of a pain. So not HTML either. That's not what I'm talking about. This one says export to Markdown. So again, that's something that Notion has done well. So I do appreciate. No, I'm referring to. You're gonna use. It's not Notion's fault, to be clear. I just want to see Notion API export data example. Does someone have an example of it? Nope, that's not it. Let's see. Notion API response. Introduction notes. Let's see. Block page. Yeah, actually, here you go. Here's an example. All right. So let's see. Let me bump this up a little bit. That's probably a little hard to read. So here's an example of what I would call a proprietary format. So imagine if you were taking notes in your note taker, and then you're like, hey, I want to export it, and because I lose access to my note taker. Usually, I would say Notions is pretty clean. It's pretty, compared to the stuff I've seen before, it's easier to follow. I can actually do something with it. Whereas with this, you can follow. But again, this is rough, because in the sense that in the event I want to modify it or I want to read, I cannot just read this, right? It would be very difficult for, like, maybe other people have brains that can do this. I cannot understand what exactly is going on here, other than that, cool, there's a title that happens to have a text that is bug bash, but then I guess there's also this status. There's a properties that has this ID that I actually don't understand the format of. And so you can see here, it's just a lot more work to parse versus something that's plain text. And so all this to say, one of the reasons Obsidian has still, to this day, I think at this point, I need to do the math on it. I've probably been using Obsidian for years at this point, easily. And it continues to have a place in my tooling, a very important place, because of its philosophy around data ownership and keeping it in a markdown format. And again, I don't know if the founders saw this coming or whatnot, and maybe philosophically they always knew, but I do think what's particularly interesting as well, to also segue a little of the AI conversation, is that for those who have been working with AI, and especially if you're starting to look into more integrated workflows where you're actually trying to figure out how to get it to create artifacts on your computer, you're looking at things like skills and this kind of thing. If these are new things to you, don't worry, we'll talk a little bit about it when we get to it. But if you're starting to look into that, what format is all of that generally being outputted as? Markdown. Because why? When you're giving instructions to the AI, you're using natural language, but you still need some kind of formatting. And so since really the most reliable way to ensure that the AI is getting the data you're passing it, Markdown continues to still be, as far as I understand, still one of the best formats to provide information to AI with when it comes to be clear, when it comes to you just writing a prompt, writing a skill, that kind of thing. If you're talking about very structured data, that becomes a separate discussion. And so what I mean by that, for those who aren't familiar, in the event that you're trying to teach the AI how to do something, then Markdown can be a bit of a tricky thing, especially when you have a very consistent way to do it. And so this is where people often create things like model context protocols. They're called MCPs. And so ways for, call it, the agents to have a very consistent way to understand how the thing works. And so given Markdown is the preferred format, honestly, for what AI outputs and what it what it consumes, then it just, honestly, the funny thing is it just cemented Obsidian in my workflow personally even more than ever, since it allows me to still use the Markdown format, but then leverage, as you can see, what Obsidian does is it actually lets you see everything in a visually aesthetic way, in a way that I don't have to sit there and parse things like this, even though technically it's a heading 2, like it just automatically looks bigger. Those can be controlled by themes, which I do plan on start doing more deep dives on these kind of things going forward. Obsidian has a lot of opportunity for personalization too, which is one of the things I like a lot about it. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to tooling and how we work, the best way to work is the best way to work with tooling is the way your brain works, generally speaking. When we have to contrive and contort our brain to work around other people's workflows, I've never found that to be truly successful. It's one thing when you adopt a principle that you think clicks for you and it opens a new, call it like, neural pathway for your brain and be like, oh, this makes a lot of sense because now I can do X, Y, Z, then that's great. But I think whenever I've seen someone release like some opinionated workflow for their like Life OS, which is Life Operating System, for, oh yeah, if you just download my framework and you import your data like this, it just works. Like, it works for, I found that like generally your brain like will initially adapt. You'll be like, cool, I totally understand and I'll do this for the first couple of weeks. And then eventually you start to realize like your use case and the way you do things is just slightly, again, you're not, unless you happen to have the exact same life as the person who created the framework, you're just going to want things a bit differently and you want it to be able to be tailored that way. And oftentimes I found that the frameworks being released that claim that they have the next thing that will solve your ADHD, they'll solve your inability to complete projects, whatever, or you'll feel so much more productive. Like at the end of the day, like that, I still have found that is still a personal journey that each person needs to take. There is no shortcut to it. You can certainly learn things that allow you to discover ways that are optimal for the way your brain works. But I do think the idea that someone can sell you some silver bullet that will just magically solve all your problems has very, at least in my experience, very consistently fallen short of its promises. So all that to say, that is Obsidian to this day still one of my favorite tools, and I have no desire to change from it at this point as well. In terms of like other productivity things, so I guess to-do apps are a big part of most people's productivity systems, and I will say, funny enough, this is the part of my system that I would say I am currently in the most flux with. So if we were to say like what app is Ben using, then I would say that Todoist is probably the main app I'm primarily using, just because it does have fairly good infrastructure that's built in terms of features for like reminders, scheduling due dates, and that kind of thing. And like it has the concept of projects and that kind of thing with filters and labels. But I will say, again, there will be more to this on the side, more on this in the future. But something about it still for me is still lacking, I guess is the way I'll put it. And so for me, I am in the midst of exploring what that is. And yeah, my personal to-do system is a combination of really tracking things through, like even now, like I've gone back on this recently. So I have a little, just like a physical journal that I basically use the bullet journal system, more or less. I am like customizing it, so I'm happy to share what I'm doing and how my thought process with it. But bullet journaling, again, just for a quick overview for those who are wondering, basically is a way where you take like a blank notebook that has just usually dots, but you can mine happens to be lined at this moment. And you just, as you can see here, you have, this one happens to be like a daily log if you want. And then it has basically little icons that indicate certain things. So dots means task. The dash here means line. The dash here, sorry, means like a note. And so, yeah, so I found that because one of the trickiest things about any to-do system that I found is that while you're capturing to-do items, the technology at this point has gotten so fast and efficient for us when this comes to this that like I found that the opposite needs to be true, at least let's say for my brain, right? To be logically consistent with what I just said, philosophically consistent. There are times you actually need to slow down to better understand what's going on and what it is you actually call it want. You say need as well, need/want to do. And so I found that the technological systems that I found, like Todoist and stuff, like there's just something about it that's too linear about its approach where all I can say something feels off. So more on this over the live streams as I solidify some of my opinions, but suffice to say is that I have a very hybrid approach when it comes to my to-do list. And so Todoist, again, for like the general app reminders, and to be honest, I even still use the built-in iOS reminders because Siri works, the native integration for that seems to work a little bit easier for me. I found that when I'm trying to get it to add it directly to Todoist through like a voice reminder, it has been less than reliable. So that I still use. So I guess, so iOS reminders, just like a standard iOS reminders app. I guess they don't have a landing page for it. There you go. Here we go. So yeah, so I still use like the native one just to pair with Siri whenever I'm on the go. That one's still good as far as my workflow. And then the other one that I want to give a shout out to as well, because this has been a big part, is Linear. And so Linear is also task apps, but like it's a little bit more of a product development centric when it comes to task management. And I found that this is particularly good with teams. And so for those who've worked in a company, you might be familiar with Jira, for better or for worse. And so this is if Jira had like a makeover and it was a bit cleaner, design a little bit more with the developer in mind. So I think that's one of the reasons why it resonates well with me. So a lot of these, when you create issues in here, for example, they can automatically create issues in GitHub. And so I'm not saying people should use this for like their life management. I've just found that when working with other people, this seems to be like a great, I enjoy the features that they have here. Like I've tried purchasing a Jira license and Atlassian before, but I found that, again, which is fair, I think they're designed purely for enterprise, and there are teams that work really well with, there are teams that work, at least, basically, yeah, they have licenses, there are teams that work with it. I found that Linear works well for me. They have a lot of features in here that I do that I think make sense, and a lot of customization options. So shout out to the Linear team for a great job on that. They're actually another example of their app is quoted a lot, I think, for a lot of local first stuff as well. So to be clear, local first, also to clarify, does not mean you only have your data on your computer. It also, it really is just the fact that you can have the data on your computer, and that local first means that you can still work on an app, and then features can expand as you gain internet access. So syncing and stuff still work perfectly fine on Linear, and they have databases and stuff. It's just that local first mindset is this idea that in the event a user loses connection to their application, that they can still actually work on said thing. So Linear has been quite good about that. If I'm on a plane, weak internet, for example, I want to create some issues. Now, granted, I would guess that there would be like a queue for, because it can't talk to GitHub. So I was mentioning earlier, it can create GitHub issues. Then clearly, in that case, it would not be able to, but I imagine there would be some sort of queue or something for issues you create. I haven't fully explored that, but that's the idea. And a lot of times Linear is held up as one of the shining examples of how local first apps can have, honestly, I say have a place in our workflows, but I would generally make the case that if your app only works with internet connection, that to me is a question of like, why? Like anything in tech, there are always exceptions, and there are reasons for why someone might call it a very staunch opinion that this app can only work with internet. But I would find, generally speaking, I would say that I find it hard to believe that for a lot of apps that they could not benefit from some sort of local first experience that they can then expand with internet. But anyways, I'll get off my high horse on that one. That is something we can talk more about at length when we work with other things. Okay. So that covers the high-level productivity side of things. And then in terms of, let's see, what else goes in most people's productivity systems. So Superhuman email is something that I have been using for quite some time and been paying because it's a paid product. And so when it comes to managing my emails, this is still my go-to tool. Now, if you can't hear the hesitation in my voice, it's because I'm still not sure I can recommend it for people as their day-to-day driver, given that there is a cost to it. I think last I saw, this one's $33. Let's see, free But there's a limitation with this, I want to say. Maybe this is new then. I wonder what, hold on, let's take a look real quick. Free pro business, sure. Correctness, sentence. Okay, sure. I don't care about the AI stuff. I'm like curious, can people actually just use the mail without instant reply, instant event, auto archive? Okay, so if you want automation, you basically need to pay. That's clearly what this is. Oh, yeah, that's why. Okay. So okay. Yeah. So my pitch does remain the same. For the features that are interesting of Superhuman, which I did do, I won't bring up just because I haven't had the time to sanitize an inbox. I don't know what's on there. So basically, it does make for they did do a good job building the UI so that like when you're hovering over your email, it's easy to snooze it to a certain time. So you can see here. So actually the productivity. So snoozing it, split inboxes is the thing they did well, where essentially you can say that for a certain email, certain subjects, whatever, go to this particular funnel inside your email inbox. And so that's been pretty good. So snooze, remind me has been a great one as well, so that it'll be like, hey, if I haven't heard from this person in 2 weeks, ping me again. However, all this stuff, again, typically speaking, honestly, I would say it feels more like you'd want this stuff more at a business level, because again, I have a hard time telling people that they should be paying, what was it, I think it was $33 a month for Superhuman. And again, if you want that hyper productivity, that's something probably worth considering. But at the same time, I would say probably for me, even I have to admit, I am probably considering whether it makes sense to continue at this price point or whether there's other opportunities because I imagine the app landscape, at least I hope, is changed a bit. So maybe there might be another one that I can more wholeheartedly recommend at this point. But again, as far as the current state of affairs and being transparent with how my workflow is, Superhuman is the one that is still kind of driving my emails. And so also the other thing too worth commenting on is that the reason also why I like Superhuman is that it makes it also easier for me to have multiple inboxes, because I do have the business and the personal. I have an email address specifically for pickleball stuff, for example. So it does make it easy to keep those in like kind of one view per se. And when I say one view, to be clear, there's a tab for each email, but I just open Superhuman itself rather than having like my Chrome with like multiple tabs, which you could argue is similar. But I think the difference is Chrome and like the web browsers, when you have multiple Google accounts logged in, it gets messed up in terms of like Drive and all that stuff, because it's like primary account. Anyways, all this to say, yeah, so Superhuman Mail, is that a different? Sure. Okay, yeah, this is probably the screenshot I actually wanted. Please go away. So yeah, it is quite good. So it does actually, one thing I will comment on, it is pretty good at like when you select all to archive or to process, it's fairly good at some of those if you deal with a lot of emails. I have found Superhuman Mail to be quite good. It's just I struggle a little bit with recommending it. Yeah, see, at this price point, I would say, yeah, just I would struggle. So anyways, again, they did a good job. Just I might want to, I personally, I think I'll explore other tooling so I can feel better about recommending a better email experience for people that doesn't cost that much a year. Okay, so let's see. We talked about that, talked about productivity, we talked about emails. I am missing one final thing that I think is core to almost every person's productivity system, and that is their calendar. And so when it comes to the calendar, certainly Google Cal is great and people try to use the native one. But honestly, this one is one that I have personally found I think I could very strongly recommend. Now, however, when I'm saying this, okay, cool. So it used to be, so be clear, I guess to explain, when I first started this kind of pitch of like why I would clearly recommend it, is because you used to have to pay for Fantastical as an app. So I forgot the flat rate, but there was a flat rate you paid, then you got access to Fantastical. And so clearly now they have a subscription model, but that given case, it looks like they may have changed it permanently. So there may not actually be a flat rate for the app itself, but clearly they now have the subscription. So to be quick, let me make sure to do a quick review. You can add accounts, all and stuff in the free. Great. Events, tasks, great. Full screen, awesome. Okay, forward emails to Fantastical, that's new. Attachments on iOS. What is push sync? Syncs your events across the event. If it doesn't have push sync, that's a little interesting to me. Calendar mirroring. Okay, tricky. Scheduling, invite people, registration deadlines, hosting. Okay. Yeah, again, it's like the state of the world with business, unfortunately. Okay, to be honest though, I would say, given that calendars are such a big deal for people, I would say if it is individual $4.75 a month, for $5 a month, and how, at least again, if the calendar is a big part of the way you do things, I would say I still would pay my own money. So not even as if it went, if I wasn't using it for the business or whatever, like I would still do it. So this is like the basic UI of it. Again, I don't want to queue up my personal one at the moment just because I'm not sure what exactly is on there. So I just want to be a little bit protective of like data sanitization. But you can see here that it's designed often really well. It's really clean. Again, it should look quite familiar to a Google Calendar or a calendar app you're using, but I found that it's just better at like with the event adding, switching between calendars, especially for those of us that do. Yeah, maybe this is part of it. For those of us that have multiple emails that we manage to have different calendars on it because we want to expose different things to different audiences, whether it's work, personal, some hobby email, whatnot, then it is actually quite nice. And then when people share calendars with you, you can change the colors and that kind of thing. And so for me, I've loved my time with Fantastical so far and happy to support the team. So this is one where I'm happy to I honestly put still like a strong recommendation on when in terms of like my tooling. And I would say it's fairly core. I don't have any intention of leaving them at any time at this point. And so honestly, it's funny. They've added new stuff to like the premium session that I haven't even had a chance to really look into. But yeah, everyone's trying to figure out ways to make their business work. So totally understand. But again, they still fantastic job on their app. So I think the only downside though is that I think Fantastical is not available on. Yeah. Fairly certain that it's Mac only. Support, costs, privacy, support, about maybe. Yep, join team. They got a nice team. Ba-bum. Yeah, great team. Yep, I don't think. Yeah, I have no reason to believe. So that was probably the one downside, the main downside to Fantastical. At this point is that if you're on Windows or Android, I don't have a recommendation for you at the moment. All right. We are now entering the final section of this live stream in terms of the current state of affairs because, we live in a world now where, at least for those of us in tech, it is basically impossible to ignore AI. I would be surprised if anyone has managed to completely avoid it as far as the news, as far as how it's impacted their workflow. Because it's the technology itself, ignoring all the other side implications that you might take with it. The technology itself has been quite revolutionary, at least from what it's been capable of. Now, how it's being sold, what's being promised, this is an entirely separate matter that we will likely cover as the sessions go on. But it's obviously changed a lot in the way we work, right? No different than from, at least speaking from a personal example, like when I first started building websites, I worked in a plain text edit file, plain Notepad for those who remember Notepad in Windows. No syntax highlighting, no linting, no checking if we had typos. It was just like we wrote the code by hand, black and white. We saved it as a .html file, and then we were like, cool. And then we would open it in a browser to see if it worked, and then we would debug it by hand. And autocomplete would eventually, when we had type checking, we would color. Syntax highlighting was a huge thing for me, I remember, because it just made it easier for me to find bugs. And that's even before like all the auto hinting and all that stuff came about. But that stuff exists now. And then, of course, came with the internet, type checking. Things have come a long way to improve our ability to work, right? And then the internet was huge for developers because with things like Stack Overflow, you were able to find solutions that were similar to your problem that you could tailor to what you were doing usually, and that's how we went by. And so the way I see AI at this point is it's another iteration on that, right? I haven't done enough research to say it's revolutionary to the scale of the internet or whatnot, but it is certainly another step forward as far as workflows go. And so to be clear, let's take the assumption here that the models we're talking about are frontier models, and we're also talking about it purely from a technological perspective, not from an access perspective of whether or not users have the ability to actually pay for it or whether tokens are sustainable. Again, those are entirely separate conversations. ideology I'm currently talking about discussing is around just the technology itself. So making the assumption that AI is, if people have access to the frontier models that then have the tokens to then play with it, it is a big deal. I think it would be irresponsible to say otherwise because it is changing the way people work, and honestly in both good and bad ways, because I don't, from what I've seen in the industry and from talking to people, there is, I think if any technology has ever been called a double-edged sword before, AI would probably want to me one of the most like best representations of a double-edged sword, because while there's a lot that's really incredible about it and what it unlocks, there is a very sinister downside to it, especially because of the way it impacts people's mental perspectives. And without diving too much into it, I would say my quick elevator pitch on this is that typically we as human beings are very good at anthropomorphizing things. And so if you're not familiar with that word, basically it's like we tend to attribute human traits to things, and we find ways to connect with things. So it's like where in Community there was like this joke of, hey, if I like put a smiley face on this pen and break it in half, like a part of you like dies a little on the inside, right? Because you like feel all of a sudden like this connection to this pen that like I drew a smiley face, because you're like, oh, it's like a thing. And then if I break it, you're like, oh, it's like the pen died. There's this kind of instinctive desire to connect for a lot of people. And one of the things that the reason I think tech has always managed to really dodge this instinctive behavior is because we've always known that whatever we see more or less is static, right? And so when you search for something on the internet, you're saying, okay, cool, like this is something someone wrote, and I evaluate it as this like artifact, just like picking up a book, right? You're like, there's a book, I can read the book. And while it feels like you can relate to a story, you're not necessarily thinking like this book is a person. And whereas the way AI has been presented, especially with these chatbots, and given that we have past history in technology for chatbots being actually chatting with an individual, granted, you might be thinking of like the scripted chatbots where you have like you click and whatnot, but in those cases, it's very clear to users that they're like, oh, I'm just going through a procedure, sorry, not procedurally generated, but I'm going through a programmatic way to get to what I want. Like clicks, like it's like the whole experience on a phone, right? Press 1 if you want our hours. Press 2 if you're looking for support. Press 0 to talk to an operator. Like we know there's not any part of us that's thinking, oh, this is a person. We're like, yeah, cool. These are like pre-configured options, whatever. The dangerous part about AI is that as we're talking to it, and because it's able to generate responses that are conversational, right? We can talk about the uncanny valley bit of it, which is, for those if you're not familiar, uncanny valley is this ability for the human brain to look at something and just know that something's weird. And so I think it's particularly used when AI, like for example, when AI creates like a picture of a human being, even though there's nothing like wrong with it, it's not like it has like the person has 5 eyes or 6 limbs or anything. You can just, there's this part of your brain that's like, something's weird. And so all that to say, so the fact that we anthropomorphize it means that there is like this instinctive desire to connect with it and see it as a different entity. And again, this is something I'm going to have to do like a whole different session on, because I think the psychology of this is not only interesting, but also unfortunately a bit scary because of the implications around how we treat this entity, especially because most people's relationship with AI at this point, I believe, is that it is a separate entity, right? Like I talk to ChatGPT, I talk to Claude, and I think when people talk about it conversationally, that's what it sounds like. Like I asked Claude this thing, right? Whereas it's funny, while people might have said like they asked Google, most of the time when they mean like I searched on Google, right? But there is an emotional difference I've noticed when people talk about AI, that it's like they feel like they talk to someone. And so this is, again, I'm going to try not to get too far deep into this, but I do want to make sure to cover this a little bit, is that the problem is that with the AI is that we have this relationship now where at one point the internet, more or less, if you search for something, the top results of what you were given were more or less authoritative resources, because we have Google, or the search engines had designed an algorithm which would provide like the most relevant resources to whatever they believe we're searching for. So we could more or less take those things as like trusted resources. So they were subject matter experts, to say the least. Most people don't Google something and then like immediately jump to the 20th page to find what they're looking for. They trust that the first page, typically, if not the first two, will find like an authoritative voice on the thing that they're asking about. Now with AI, we have this thing where like, I think because we have this pattern of thinking that when we ask technology for something, it gives us something that's trusted, we enter a dangerous territory because this is no longer true. Granted, while AI, I think in its earlier days, there was more to easily criticize because, for example, when you would ask what ingredients are in pizza, it would have a poor time differentiating the fact that on some commercials they actually use glue on pizza toppings in order to give it a different, like a more, like the cheese would look more appetizing on camera. But I think but the AI wouldn't know the difference, that that's not edible, but they would see data that people had used glue. I think there was a screenshot at one point, or someone had said that it actually said that there was like glue on pizza or whatever. And so we've moved away from that. I will admit that I have not seen as much hallucination from some of these AI responses. But this is the problem, is that you now have to you have to have a working knowledge typically of what you're asking about to evaluate whether or not the AI is giving you a trusted answer. And this is difficult because now what I would say is, if you're for those who treat AI as a separate entity, you end up in this place where the AI can either be a subject matter expert, where it's like it had managed to generate an authoritative resource for you that is tailored to your situation, that is worth trusting. And that does happen like more often than not, right? Especially nowadays, let me be clear. If you're using AI correctly, I'll put that in air quotes, correctly, typically your responses are pretty good. But when I say typically, though, I'm talking like a good percentage. I'm not saying like 90% of the time or anything. I dare not even venture a percentage, but just it's enough that people feel comfortable with it. Yet at the same time, it's also very capable of completely hallucinating little things, and that especially when programming, when one character, when one concept, if you're just, it's a typical off by one issue. If you're off by one thing, it can completely throw you for a loop in terms of finding your solution or what bug it causes. And so you have to then delineate that between the hallucinating suggestions, the good suggestions from a subject matter expert perspective. But then, funny enough, then there's this other part where it's the mediocre suggestions, right? Where it's not wrong. It's not like it's completely hallucinated, but it's not a good answer. But if you don't know that, you won't know any different. And so all this to say, when it comes to this AI stuff, it's been a tough journey because there's a lot to navigate in terms of how it impacts us, in terms of its trustability. And again, as I think I've noticed a lot of times, we're inclined to trust the tool we want to, right? Because also life is easier if we can trust the tooling that we use. And so, okay, all that to say, as far as where I've come with, as far as my current journey with AI, so like most, I started a little bit before this. I think AI was a little bit more relevant for developers earlier on because in VS Code, we had this opportunity to do, I think it was like auto prediction. So VS Code auto predicting. And so it would do things, not that. It was like this. Can I open this? Oh, let's see. Do they have here we go. Perfect. Yeah, so they call these inline suggestions. I would call them kind of like predictions in a way. And so it would be like you're like write a function where it's like, hey, calculate the days between dates, and then it would try to anticipate what it is you're trying to write. And so to me, this was like the earliest form of AI because that's essentially what it is, right? It's trying to generate what it thinks you need. And then again, while fun, that was a bit distracting, I found. And so, yeah, granted, I've had my explorations with chatbots, with ChatGPT, with Claude, and then moved on over into just more integrated workflows. For those, hopefully for the developers, you started working with integrated harnesses. So that's not what I wanted. I just want your Claude Code marketing page. Oh, that's not what I want at all. Here, overview, Claude Code, sure. It's fine. I can just bring this up. So here's an example. I have my terminal open. I fired the Claude command. This is what shows up. And so it allows me to interact with Claude. It allows me to give it access to certain folders and stuff. So it's like a terminal way to interact with Claude, but then do stuff on your computer that it can actually save files and that kind of stuff. For those who aren't developers, though, The other one that I would definitely recommend checking out, which I do plan on doing some resources around because I do think it's pretty important to unlocking your ability to use AI, is beyond the chatbot, is ability to start actually creating artifacts and managing those and essentially personalizing your AI. And so Claude Cowork here is essentially a desktop app. And I believe ChatGPT has an equivalent, but I would be, let me put it this way. I would be surprised if ChatGPT does not have an equivalent. But basically, it allows you to just do a bunch of stuff. So you can see here, prompted, generate this thing. So it can actually generate, say, like a spreadsheet that you can actually save that's on your computer. So anyhow, so I would call this like integrated workflows. That's like the next step of AI. So I went through my whole phase with that as well. And then so currently in the moment, I've been also exploring to a friend of mine recommended. It's called Conductor. And sorry, I think it's Conductor Build. So eventually, for those as you like start like working through things, I found that especially for developers working with GitHub repos, Conductor has been kind of my go-to workspace for working with agents while working with projects as well. Because as you can see here, it does a good job at actually giving you the ability to see all the different projects you're working on. You can create workspaces, which automatically create branches. And then those branches then like, you can work on different things. You can see like the diffs and stuff. Like, it's a really good integrated experience, to be honest, as far as that goes. And so that's been like something I've been exploring more with, and that I think it's free at the moment. We're checking out. I still need to figure out like what exactly the business model is and how it works. But as far as tooling goes, it is definitely one of the better harnesses that I've seen, and I'm definitely starting to throw around some tools with terminology around AI that I need to go into exploring. But quickly, for those who don't know, harnesses are just, the way I like to think of it is that they're a way for you to interact with the model itself. So whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's Claude, or whatever other one you want to use, they're just like almost like a middle person where they allow you to interact with with the model, which is that kind of, what we said, Claude, ChatGPT, that kind of thing. But then also giving you a kind of a UI workflow. So basically some sort of GUI, which is a graphical user interface like this, where you can actually see, oh, here are my chats. Here on the right, for example, you can see all the different changes that have been made. As you can see here, you can actually create a PR directly through this. You can have terminals, you can run stuff, and it kind of manages all that for you automatically, so you can focus on the work rather than the nitty-gritty pieces. Because I've done it manually myself, where I had to create branches and stuff, and it's a decent amount of work. And so when you want to work at a faster pace, because a lot of times when you're working with AI agents, sometimes it can be throwaway branches or those kind of things, Conductor has been probably one of the best integrated experiences I've seen when it comes to working with models. So this has been, if your parallel work is of any interest to you, then I would say so far Conductor has been one of the better ones that I've worked with so far. And so, yeah, as far as like current state of AI for myself as well, the models. And so most people usually like to ask like what models I'm using. So in terms of models, I am, again, because working with tech, this kind of stuff, bread and butter. I work with both ChatGPT and Claude. My go-to is Claude if I could only use one model, that is my preferred model at this point. I think my go-to model essentially is Opus 4.8 with the 1 million context, just to try to minimize memory loss as much as possible. But even that, again, as anyone who's worked with this long enough will tell you, there's just, the AI forgets things. It's one of the things that people struggle with when they work with AI, is what I'll say. And so, yeah, so I like to use multiple models when I can, because they are trained on different things. They have different quirks. And so having them either review work and then give different opinions on things and challenge it and see what happens is a way for me to at least give some sort of validity to the work that's being done. And then also has been interesting, just observe and see the difference. Again, both models are very capable, to be clear. I know plenty of people in other teams who ChatGPT is their go-to when they're building things. I would say it basically just depends on how you work, which one you prefer, or more importantly, especially if you're doing this for work, whatever your work is willing to pay for. People are probably wondering about Gemini. I've done some work with it, but I haven't had a chance to really dive deep into it in a way that I've considered it a major driver. So it'll probably have to be it'll probably have to be added into my workflow at some point, just so I can get more experience with it. But in terms of, that's where I'm at as far as models go. And then finally, in terms of how I work with AI at this point, I think the easiest way to explain it at this point is, so it's basically a combination. If we were to do this in a way that has, I think like this, and then where's Conductor? I will throw that in there. Yep. Okay. So what I will say is my general workflow with AI these days basically involves with if I'm like looking to brainstorm, work on something, I'll use Claude, right, to spin up as my model. And so inside of Conductor, I'll spin up a branch typically inside. So let's say honestly, like even if it's writing a blog post. So to be clear, actually, I don't use AI to write. I have strong opinions about using AI to write blog posts or write things that are supposed to be in your voice, even when it's technically trained on your voice. Reasons for that, I don't want to get on another soapbox, but I do find it useful as a rubber duck, right? And so in terms of how I work with AI, I do think this is rubber AI. Generational AI has been like the best evolution of rubber ducking, I think, to happen to people who have used the technique and who use it to make it even more effective. And so for those who don't know what rubber ducking is, so rubber ducking, I don't have a rubber duck, but I do have a little baby Totoro. And so essentially what it is that back then developers, when they're working by themselves, they would get stuck on a given problem. And so when it came time, people would be like, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do. People say, we should do the rubber duck method, which is where you take a rubber duck. And again, people actually, that's because I don't know who the origin is, but basically you take this inanimate object and you talk the problem through with it. So you'd be like, so what I'm trying to do is this, and then I noticed this is a problem. And what it ultimately boils down to be honest, what rubber ducking is that you were basically talking the problem aloud, and it allowed your brain to process and sort through things in a way that oftentimes it end up leading to some sort of light bulb moment where you're like, oh wait, now that I'm explaining to you this way, I realize the problem with it is this, right? And so it was like a way to honestly, as I'm thinking about it, it was a way to intentionally slow your brain down and not get caught up in rabbit holes. Because I think when a lot of developers, when you're looking at code or you're trying to solve something or solve problems, you get really tunnel visioned on the way you're trying to do things. And it's when you're trying to talk things out that almost it allows your brain to relax a second and to expand its perspective. And so generational AI in a way has been phenomenal for that, because now you actually have something that would, in a sense, talk back at you. Again, pros and cons, right? Sometimes you just want the silence to let your brain marinate in the concept. But then when you do want to talk things through and you feel like you're spinning, so for example, like you're trying to discern between whether you should go with Electron or you should go with Tori, for example, then AI can be a great way to at least have that conversation. Now, granted, you have to always, as always, you have to not treat, I guess this actually goes into my next commentary on how I work. But when working with AI, I think you don't treat it as like this mentor that's like telling you what's best. So when you're like Electron versus Tori, and it's like, you should use Electron because it's the most popular app. But, right. And so I think if you have the mindset of being willing to debate with the agent and make sure you actually get the answer you want rather than just taking what it prescribes, I think it's a phenomenal way to rubber duck, to be clear. So that's what I mean to say when I say it's a phenomenal evolution of rubber ducking, is because a lot of times, like for me, for example, if I'm exploring something and I don't have someone that I can like basically have a debate with, because I'm like just trying to like figure out the merits of it. And in some ways, I really just need to sit with it. But having a debate partner would be nice, because then I can try to be like, but I have this problem and I'm not sure this is actually the best fit, or I would like to try to optimize for this. Then like the AI can be good at being a bit of that debate partner. With the one caveat, though, is that as many of us know who've worked with AI long enough, it does try to agree with you more often than not. So you have to almost intentionally disregard its agreeableness. And so I don't mean just merely like turning off like, that's absolutely right. I mean that I think the model is incentivized to try to go with whatever you tell it. So you have to almost be like, look for the holes immediately rather than like blindly, basically rather than accepting what they say at face value. Like you need to be settled with the decision and understanding the rationale behind it before merely accepting the AI's sort of response to it. And that requires discipline. I think that's one of the hardest things with AI. But to conclude my workflow discussion, all of this to say, when I'm working with Conductor, when I'm working with Claude, everything always feeds back to essentially like an Obsidian file. Sorry, I say Obsidian, a Markdown file, which is rendered what? In Obsidian. So I try very hard at this point. I'm still working on quite the workflow, but whenever Claude creates an artifact, whether it's like a design document, some sort of documentation on what it thinks to do for architecture-wise, like I'm trying to get it to a point where like it's fully integrated with Obsidian so that at any time I can go in, edit, modify things, and then it can still reflect accordingly in the workflow when the AI is working with said thing. I'm still not in a place where like I think I could like confidently share that in terms of here's my workflow and then learn from it what you will. That is still taking some time, but that's the principle behind it in terms of the tooling and what I'd like. because I think one of the tricky things about the AI is that it can generate so much, but if you don't have a good way of viewing it, editing it, and then reflecting on it, then it very quickly becomes like this garbled mess of data that's hard to sort through. And given that AI is token, it's often token inefficient. So it's just like it's trying to consume as much data as it can, but that's not always the most effective use of it, and it just doesn't know what to do. I think that's actually quite important to the process. So I think generally this is like the kind of trifecta for me at the moment. But with Obsidian, you can also, I guess it's a quadrifecta, because there's VS Code obviously as part of my workflow, because I still need to see what changes are being made and how to modify it. So that's been good. But yeah. So anyhow, all that to say, that I think is a wrap on the AI stuff. Hey, I see B-Boy Acres in the chat. What's up? Sorry if I'm late to seeing this. But yeah, okay. So I think those are the things. Let's go ahead and switch it on over. Okay. Let's do a quick wrap up. So as far as today goes, this was a fun inaugural episode for Ben's Open Tabs to talk about really where I'm at these days, the current state of affairs. And so we talked a bit about the tech stack in terms of what I'm working with. We talked a bit about productivity, some of the core apps, and like some of the ideas behind it. And then, of course, again, how can we talk these days about tech, productivity, and these kind of things without talking about AI? We have a segment on that with different thoughts peppered in here and there. And yeah, at a high level, again, really what I want to do with this space is create some time for us to work on things together, for people to ask about things. And then more importantly, a space for me to also just share ideas and then talk through things with you. Because if anyone's ever done any content creation before, you'll know that the time it takes to record, edit, and do things can be very expensive upfront, especially when it comes to how things work. And so for me, I think I have always enjoyed the live stream format a lot because it allows me to be a bit more impromptu and kind of show things on the go. And it has been a bit more, as a result, a bit more sustainable workflow for me when it comes to answering and explaining things. Granted, I hope to eventually get to a point where there'll be more like formally recorded things, but this is where we're starting at this point. And yeah, so excited to have you all along for the journey. And then as far as if you're wondering about what's the plan for how these live streams work, I'm working on getting a calendar and all this set up, but the idea is that this will be a weekly thing that I do on Wednesdays at 12:30 Eastern. So that'll be 9:30 Pacific. And then I don't remember all the other time zones, but that's like the general plan. And then in terms of duration, generally, usually at bare minimum an hour, but could be as long as an hour and a half. Like this intro session clearly is taking about an hour and a half to kind of get through. If you're wondering about replays, my plan is to leave the replay up on Twitch as it normally is up for a bit, but then for like a couple days. But then my plan is to make sure that it's basically uploaded to YouTube. That way I can cut out some of any sort of dead white space, that kind of thing. And then that way there'll be like a permanent home for all the replays in case you're not around to check out the live recap. And I'll do my best to try to make sure that there are timestamps and stuff for those that don't want to sit through the whole thing. So you can kind of watch the parts that you're interested in or are most relevant for you. With that said, I think that is a wrap for the inaugural session of Ben's Open Tabs. Thanks everybody for joining, for those who joined live. Again, it was great having you all. And then I will see you all in the next session. Thanks, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.